between our guests, Vince Aletti and Frank Horvat. This dialogue is in conjunction with an important exhibition of Frank Horvat's photographs entitled Horvat Fashion, curated by Vince Aletti at Presentation House, and it's there until December the 23rd. I'd like to ask curator and director Reid Scher to introduce our guests.
Thank you very much, Sandra. And my thanks to Emily Carr University and to David McWilliam for facilitating our conversation today and for inviting us to invite you and welcome. I'll keep it brief. What I will say in advance is that the dialogue today between Vince and Frank will be conversational based on some of the research that Vince has done on Frank's career, and with a specific focus on the fashion photography that's on view at Presentation House Gallery, as Sandra mentioned. Vince has been a friend of the gallery for some years now and is a New York-based curator, critic, and collector with a profound knowledge of fashion photography. By way of introduction, he recently curated a series of exhibitions on fashion photography for the International Center of Photography in New York, and those exhibitions formed a year-long cycle that included This Is Not a Fashion Photograph, Weird Beauty, Fashion Photography Now, and Avedon, Fashion 1944 to 2000. We first got to know Vince through an exhibition that he did for us called Mail, which was on show at Presentation House Gallery in 2008. Aletti is a regular contributor on photography to The New Yorker and was the Village Voice's art editor from 1994 to 2005, as well as being the paper's photo critic for 20 years. A collection of his weekly columns on disco music, The Disco Files, 73 to 78, New York's Underground, was published in 2009, and he won the International Center of Photography's Infinity Award for writing in 2005. So it's a privilege to be able to have Vince back in Vancouver for this show. Frank Horvat was born in 1928 in Italy. In the early 1950s, after traveling to Pakistan and India as a freelance photographer, Horvat settled in London, working for Life magazine and Picture Post. In 1955, the same year his work was first shown in the Museum of Modern Art in New York, exhibition The Family of Man, Horvat moved to Paris, where he first started focusing on fashion photography and when he joined Magnum. During this time, Horvat worked for major publications such as Jardin de Mode, Elle, Glamour, Vogue, and Harper's Bazaar. He worked with important designers such as Coco Chanel and Givenchy, as well as the Parisian nightclubs Le Sphinx and Crazy Horse. His work was included in major group exhibitions, fashion photographs at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London in 1985, as well as Vanités at the Centre National de la Photographie in Paris in 1993. And of course now Horvat Fashion, which we're extremely privileged to have at Presentation House Gallery up until the end of December, in which if you have not seen it, I encourage you to come. One thing before I bring Vince and Frank into conversation is that I would like to stress, and this came in an email from Frank in my invitation to join in this discussion, that he would like it to be clear that he is not a representative of fashion photography, and I think the conversation today will touch on that. So please welcome Vince Aletti and Frank Horvat.
Thank you. Thank you, Sandra, and thank you, Reid. I wanted to just sort of have a fairly wide-ranging conversation about Frank Horvat's career and work. We're starting with an image of... sorry? Would this help? Is this better? Okay. We have a self-portrait from 1945, I believe.
I believe it was 45, I'm not sure.
And we'll be cycling through a number of images, mostly from his fashion work. but I wanted to start with this self-portrait, and with this, just to get a sense of what got you interested in photography in the first place.
Well, this is what I usually write in all my CVs and self-biographies, autobiographies, which is that I had a friend who told me it was the best way of meeting girls.
And did it prove to be useful?
No. No, I was always unsuccessful.
Well, I would think that would almost lead you directly into fashion photography, but clearly fashion came later.
Came later, yes.
So where were you? You moved around a lot in your life. Where were you when you first started taking photographs seriously?
Well, I was in Italy, and yes, I took photographs because I had found it was just after the war, and it was a time when there were plenty of not fashion magazines, reportage magazines, news magazines, which were publishing photographs. And so I slipped into this rather by mistake. I thought of myself, one day I'll be a great writer or a great artist or something, and photography was just third best. It wasn't really interesting. And except that it worked. I mean, the first time I bought color film and I put it in my camera, which was a Rolleicord, and I photographed the woman I was living at the time. I was 21. And I showed the photograph to the great magazine of Italy, which was Epoca, and they said yes and made a cover of it. So my first color photograph became a cover. So it worked. So I thought of myself as great, of course, which I still do, of course. And when I went to Paris, I went to show my photographs to Henri Cartier-Bresson. And then he took the whole pack of my prints and turned them upside down because all he cared for was the composition. And said, look, this is no good. This is hopeless. Go and go to the Louvre and look at the paintings by Poussin and try to understand what the composition is about. So that was...
was that discouraging or
no, that was the best thing that happened to me in my life. No, that was great. It was great because it's not that at the time I understood Henri Cartier-Bresson's photographs. I don't think I understood much, but I was one of many young photographers who respected him, who saw him as an idol. He saw him as a leader, or someone who was worth imitating, because what he seemed to say was that photography was just as important as writing or music or painting, and that it should be treated as such. So that was fantastic. So that changed everything, and that changed the way I looked through the camera and the way the moment I pressed the button. But the funny thing is that now, 70 years later, when I look at my first photographs, I see, well, after all, in some of them, it's already there, even before Cartier-Bresson. And what I'm trying to do now, to some extent, was there already when I was 17. So, next question is, what is this something? I don't know. All I can say.
It seems, it seems almost instinctive because it feels very natural to you. But were you looking at other photographers at the time that you started working in photography? Other people?
Well, it's a good question. The thing is that there were no photography exhibitions, at least not in my part of Europe.
But magazines?
There were magazines. So to me, photography was magazines. So we would look at life, and we would look at all the various imitations of life in Europe, like Mach or Stern or whatever. And photography was that. And only much later I realized that there was another photography, like Steichen or like Stieglitz or like Weston, of which for years I had no idea. For me at the time, photography was photo reportage.
And how did you become one of those photographers, one of those magazine photographers?
Well, the obvious thing seemed to be, and was for many other young photographers, to take your camera and to go on a trip far away and to photograph the world that people had never seen before. I mean, going to India and Pakistan and showing what those places were like seemed you had the impression you were revealing something. And then, of course, it turned out that revealing something wasn't so easy at all. Because I went to Pakistan with my second-hand Leica and with little money my mother had given me.
On your own, not on assignment?
On my own, without an assignment, without an agency, without nothing. And I disembarked, and I thought, it was all lying in front of me. And it wasn't. What did lie in front of me was heat, was confusion, was a great mess, and nothing really that meant anything that the magazine would publish. So for some time I was really lost, and I had a very hard time finding things that would be understandable to magazine readers. And of course, all I thought were magazine readers and magazines that would buy my photographs. And then I was lucky. I was lucky because I found I lived in a big town, Lahore, and there I found a photo lab which would print my photos, so I could choose for my contact prints and have them printed and accept the prints and send them to agents or to magazines, and they started being published. So that worked.
What were the first things that were published, and how did you decide that they were? I mean, was it the magazine that decided that they were good, or was it?
Well, it was a magazine, but I had an idea of what the magazines wanted, which wasn't difficult. So one of there was the first story. That was a photograph that was presented in the Family of Men. Was a Mohammedan wedding. And the point of the wedding was that the bridegroom and the bride hadn't seen each other before, so they exchanged their first glance after the wedding and through a mirror. So of course I couldn't photograph the real thing. I found a family that was open enough to let me photograph, and I took this photograph of the face of the girl in the mirror, as the bridegroom would see her. And one of those photographs got into the Family of Men exhibition.
And one of those, and that picture is in our show as well.
It's in your presentation. It's not a terribly good photograph, actually, now. But it meant something at the time.
It's one of the reasons why I wanted to include that in the show is that it's so much about feminine beauty and sort of this revelation of it. And a kind of recognition of it on her part and on the part of the camera, but it so much also relates to the way we see women in fashion.
But I would say that the main thing I would like to say in this conversation, and to these people who nicely came to listen, is that I don't think I'm mainly a photographer.
You don't think you're mainly a photographer?
No, that's secondary.
What are you mainly?
I don't know. I'm curious about what's around me, and I try to find the explanation, to find the answer, to put it all together. And photography is just one way. If I was a good writer, I think I would be much preferable. But I do what I can with photography. But the main thing is to make to try to understand what goes on and express it.
And photography has been a very effective expression for you.
Photography has been okay. I'm grateful to photography. I have nothing to say against photography.
I'm going to move just to our next picture, just to give a sense of one of the things when we first started talking about the show at Presentation House. You made it very clear that it was important to you that although we were focusing on fashion, that we also include reportage and work that put the fashion into perspective and put it into a kind of larger context of your other work. This is one of the pictures, this running man in London,
yes,
that that I wanted to include.
Yes. Well, you see, I tried to present or to order my photographs in an iPad application. And at one point, I divide them into photographs that I take and photographs that I make, meaning directive and non-directive photography. And what I wished for this exhibition, and what Vince Aletti did marvelously well, is to place the photographs in such a way that one is never quite sure whether they are staged or not. You wonder if Frank Horvat asked those people in the street to stand there or not, and whether the girl did what he was told or just did it out of her own. You never quite know, and this ambiguity is what I was trying to get. And this is where it becomes amusing. This ambiguity is what Cartier-Bresson, who remained a great friend, what Cartier-Bresson thought was a great mistake.
Really?
Yes. When I saw my first fashion photographs, he said, "Mais tu peux pas faire ça. This can't be done. C'est un pastiche. It's a mixture. Your eyes are a witness, and then you witness reality, as we Magnum photographers do. Or you are a fashion photographer who stages things like Richard Avedon. That's fine too, but you can't do both at the same time."
You proved him wrong, clearly.
Well, I think he was wrong.
Well, and you know, I think that there are a number of other fashion photographers who worked in a similar way after you. William Klein, for instance, Saul Leiter, Jean-Luc Sieff, who had a very similar style.
Yes, and they started more or less at the same time, in some cases in different ways. Bill Klein was anti-fashion.
Yes.
I wasn't anti-fashion. He was anti-fashion, and
but in fact, you know, I'm always surprised by that, because in fact he made a lot of amazing fashion photographs over a long period of time.
But being
hating it all the time.
Yeah. And I mean, I must say, this was one of the great things of his art director, who was Alex Lieberman, to put into his Vogue magazine someone who would be anti-fashion. It sort of improved the rest of Vogue. I mean, that was a very intelligent move on the part of Alex Lieberman.
Yeah.
And William Klein filled this role extremely well.
But I think, you know, in a very aggressive way, and doing work that felt like it came from the street, but also was very, very staged. Lots of kind of gimmicky things.
Yes, and what I wouldn't have done, and what he did, was he was treating the models as objects, as puppets.
Right.
And for me, of course, my fashion photography was really a realization of my wish to womanize. So, you know, I wouldn't treat them as puppets.
No, I think that really comes across. There's a warmth in the work that I think comes across really beautifully. Let's see, I'm going to move ahead. Mostly what the images that we're starting with are a reportage. This is a dancing couple in London, if I remember.
Yes.
I just wanted to show some sense of where the reportage fits into fashion material. This is a portrait or an image of Coco Chanel.
Yes.
How did this come about?
Well, I was photographing one of her fashion shows, and she at the time was old and didn't want to be seen. But she wanted to watch her fashion shows. So she had a system of mirrors built in such a way that she could be in the staircase coming down from her office and watch her show without being seen. She had supposedly been a very good-looking woman and didn't want to show herself as she was. And I happened to stand at the bottom of those stairs, so I did see her and could photograph her.
So in a way, it's a revealing picture, but it's very discreet at the same time. And you respect her wishes not to be seen, but also to be
well, you know,
present.
I just happened to be there. I mean, you know, when you are a photographer, the main thing really is to catch opportunities.
I'm sorry?
To catch opportunities.
And, yes.
whatever opportunity is given. And when you are too much, looking for what you are looking for, well, you miss a lot of opportunities. So as long as you keep your eye and your mind open to opportunities, you catch a few things.
This is an early fashion show. Do you remember the circumstances?
Not in the least.
Oh, okay. It's probably not important. This you described as your first fashion photograph.
Yes, that was much before I started doing real fashion photography. I was paid by an Italian magazine to photograph high fashion collection in Florence. And I did it with a Rolleiflex camera or a Rolleicord camera. And I could only shoot like 30 seconds each dress and each model, or 2 minutes. There had to be at least 3 dresses on one roll because the whole thing was paid like next to nothing. And so I just photographed, 60 dresses in a day, and had to photograph them in this hotel in Florence, where the fashion shows took place. And the furthest I could go from the hotel was a square in front of the hotel, where there were those hackney cars. And so I thought, it was a great change to photograph one of the models with a horse. And I never thought of it as a good photograph. And then it turned out to become a bestseller and to become sort of iconic.
It has this. It indicates a direction for you.
Apparently.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you about this because the young boy in this image is your son, Michel.
Yes.
And how did this picture come about?
Well, again, I couldn't tell you 60 years later. What I do know is that at that time I had the impression I couldn't make an interesting photograph if there was only the girl in the dress, because that didn't seem so interesting to me, especially not the dress. And so I always tried to get something in. And what was easiest and most at hand were my children. So I took Michel along, and he was playing with whatever he found. And I probably liked the moment when the model's face was hidden, because the model's face again was a conventional thing that everyone would show and that the model would present, which was the last thing I wanted to show. So that's probably why I picked that one.
The last thing you wanted to show, you said something about that last night too. I was puzzled by that. That you at one point were doing pictures where the model's head was deliberately cut off.
Well, yes. I mean, the last thing I want to photograph is what people like to present. So the last thing I would have liked to show.
Reverse.
The last thing I would have liked to show in Paris is the Eiffel Tower. And now, of course, most of the money I make is with photographs of the Eiffel Tower, which I bought for people.
Let's see. Well, this series from India, I wanted to show. This is. We don't have pictures from this actually in the show, but we have an image of. We have one copy of this magazine in the vitrine as part of the exhibition. For me, it's a reportage that also touches on fashion. It was done for French Vogue.
Well, it's a story that has nothing to do with my photography, but it will amuse you. In 1974, Indira Gandhi had a bad press. She was considered dictatorial, and so she needed a good press. So when a third world dictator at the time needed a good press, would go to Vogue and say, how much will it cost me to have a special issue about my country?
Oh.
And that's what Indira did
that's how it came about.
with French Vogue.